had this idea about sort of in the spirit of organizing, kind of putting a context to these series of talks. We wanted to have more Hawaiian leaders and other important leaders come and just talk and engage. So I kind of came up with this idea of putting a name to the series, Hawaiian Conscientism, and that was really born out of a class that Kalekua taught a couple of years ago. And it was a really good class at Maui Community College, and they broadcasted it here on Olelo. Some of you may have seen it, but it was really awesome. And he was really just breaking down myths, breaking down preconceived notions of what is history that's been written, or as Malcolm X says, history that's been whitened, and just kind of challenging some of our consciousness, you know. And he taught the class, and the class was done, and that was about it. But I just remember that name, Hawaiian Conscientism, and what it was about. So talking with him, said, hey, we want to start this series, we want to call it Hawaiian Conscientism. And the term conscientism is really born really out of Kwame Nkrumah from Africa, and he was a brilliant political analyst, theorist, you know, and he coined the term, and it's really, as Kalekua said, you know, I really can't give you the definition of it, but together we'll define it collectively. But I think it's rooted in critical consciousness, and resistance, and different types of resistance that translates to action. And so, what does that mean? How do we define that kind of stuff? Simple things as like cultural practices to, you know, ku'e and protests and occupation, etc. But some of the things that we want to do is really just bring together these different ideas that contribute to conscientism, yeah. And one of the things that I'm learning myself as an activist who's been kind of just fighting, I realize that the more we get sucked into just fighting, the more we're operating from a weak base, yeah, because we just mobilize, and we got to understand the difference between mobilizing and organizing long term. And so I have this little theory that I talked about last time. Sometimes I talk about it, that I think we should look at resistance in terms of conscientism kind of in two things: ku'e and kukulu, yeah. And I realized that if I ku'e to the max, I don't kukulu, I don't build nothing, I don't create lasting power. So I started to shift my efforts over to kukulu, to building and creating. And ku'e is important, but I don't do it as much. For me, I kind of look at my ratio as 80% kukulu, 20% ku'e. And it's important to ku'e, to resist and protest. As Brother Skippy said, sometimes we're dealing with small fires, but small fires can cause big damage. So we got to put out the small fires. But meanwhile, our efforts really, we want to build and create power, yeah? And so we're organizing. We have our group MANA, Movement for Aloha no Ka'aina. We have HAWAIIAN component here. I got my farm, Hana Kehao, where we have a land base that we operate off of. And it's really our way of creating space that we control, and where we can begin to think and act independently. And that's another thing to me that's important. Kalekua, one of his famous lines, more important than independence to him are Hawaiians who think and act independently. Yeah? So, something to think about in terms of Hawaiian conscientism, how we define that and how we make it understandable to ourselves. But with that said, I'd like to call upon my co-organizer, the lady who keeps things on schedule, on track, and always keeps me from deviating. Lima.
So I just want to kind of quickly transition and root this conversation in a way that's really relevant to us right here. So borrowing from our special guest book, Decolonizing Methodologies, the Hawaiian Conscientism series is a part of a larger agenda for action. I loved how she talked about that. By action, we mean both political and direct action, but also proactive, forward-thinking efforts to increase power for our people, towards self-determination and emancipation from oppressive confines of occupation. Our university here, the University of Hawaii, sits on land that was seized from the Hawaiian Kingdom at the time of the overthrow. While much good and many allies to Kanaka Oiwi, those genealogically connected to this land, have come out of the university. As an institution, it continues to wield its power against Oiwi voices. For example, those who oppose the construction of a 30-meter telescope on the summit of our sacred mountain, Mauna Kea, or who oppose the use of the university as an institution of high research for the very military that has done so much damage to our lands, minds, and bodies. Research used to forward U.S. imperial expansion around the world at the expense of many lives. So Indigenous research, and I know that there's a lot of us here are students. I'm so happy to see so many students here, and a lot of us are Indigenous to our homelands. Indigenous research at the university then is an opportunity to co-opt the university toward to forward the drives and visions and philosophies of our own definition. And at the first Hawaiian Conscientism talk with Kalekua Ka'eo, he told us that the power to define is really where it's at. If you have the power to define, you therefore have dominion over that. When they have the power to define us, they have dominion over us. And if we allow them to define, then we are allowing them to have dominion over us. Dr. Tuhiwai Smith has been instrumental in helping us to define our own research agendas, our intentions for being here in the first place, and she has helped us to articulate and better understand that as Oiwi or as Indigenous people, our place in the university comes with a particular kuleana, or responsibility, that being to use our time here to forward the self-determination and social justice efforts of our people. So we are honored to have her here today. We are honored to have another brilliant mind in our presence here at Kamakuku at Hawaiian Studies, a cousin in the great Moana Nui Akea, and please help me welcome from Aotearoa and from the University of Waikato, Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith.
Well, thank you for having me here, and maybe if I talk for about 20 minutes, then open it up for conversation with you. It will help me contextualise what I want to say and maybe respond to the more specific questions that you might have. Let me start, because you had Hone and Hilda Harawira here as your first speakers, and they're a bit younger than me. So when I was in an activist group called Ngā Tamatoa, Hilda was still in school. And I remember as part of that activism, we had decided as a group that we would educate, that we wouldn't just activate, but we would go out and inform. And so one of my roles in that group was to go and talk to secondary school students. And we would approach schools to see whether they would let us in, and they mostly did not. But in the case where Hilda went to school, there was a particular group of teachers who invited us along. And so I guess when I look back on that era, Ngā Tamatoa was the main Māori activist group of the 1970s. And we had two specific agendas. One was the Treaty of Waitangi, and the other one was the compulsory teaching of Māori language in schools. And it was really a very small group who belonged to Ngā Tamatoa, but its strength was it could mobilise thousands. And there were lots of creative strategies for mobilising people and calling them, calling things to attention. It was very creative, and actually there was a lot of fun involved, as well as a lot of things which were not so funny. And in reflecting on that activism of that era, it was a time, the Vietnam War was on, there were groups, there were feminist groups, gay and lesbian groups, anti-Vietnam War groups. So it was greatly influenced by the civil rights movement in the US, by the anti-Vietnam War movement around the world, and the American Indian movement. So our ideas were coming from a range of sources, and we did read the work of Malcolm X. And I particularly read the work of Frantz Fanon, who was writing more out of the Algerian war context. So there was a time when those ideas were not only discussed, but we could see their immediate application to our context. But not all activist groups kind of had the same analysis of what was happening in New Zealand at that time. So clearly feminists focused on the patriarchal nature of society. The gay and lesbian movement focused on the heterosexual, the dominance of heterosexuality in New Zealand society. The anti-Vietnam War group focused on the injustice of fighting a war in Vietnam. And really our group, Ngā Tamatoa, thought, well, you can fight all those battles, but you're fighting them on our land. And before trying to change the world out there, perhaps we should address the world at home. And so we really began the work of thinking about what it means to be Indigenous Māori in New Zealand in the 1970s and beyond. We learned quite a few things about being about activism. And I heard it echoed just now, that you can react to something unjust, and you can put a lot of energy into protesting and resisting a particular injustice. But in parallel, you have to imagine a different kind of world where that injustice doesn't exist. And you do have to learn how to articulate that world. So when we started, we actually had no friends. Our elders were disdainful of us. They thought we were disrespectful, rude, and that we were doing things that brought shame on our communities and on our families. And I remember being at community events, and we were called out, by name, and told that our grandparents would be turning over in their graves because we dared to belong to this group. The men got into fist fights and punch-ups because we were seen as challenging our own elders. So we really had to work hard to articulate our message, and so we reduced our message to two: that we wanted the Treaty of Waitangi to be recognised, and we wanted our language to be taught in schools. Now, of those two, the treaty was clearly the more political, right? But the language was the one that united people. Most Māori agreed with the second part, right? They had questions about, well, who's going to teach it? When is it going to be taught? Who can actually speak it? Can you get a job? But everyone agreed that our language was important. When it came to the treaty, there were more divisions. And so having those two agendas was quite useful because we could flip between one and the other at any one time. But like a lot of activist groups in the 1970s, we all grew up. We got other lives, and the agenda moved on. So there was a huge Māori language land march to Parliament. There was a land march to Parliament. So the activist agenda broadened, and it brought more groups into that agenda. And so that says two things about activism. It's often a coalition of different activist groups who have slightly different ideologies or ways of practicing, or they just come from different parts of the country. And we were seen by some of the other groups maybe as purists in keeping to our particular agenda and not really wanting to collaborate as much as some of the other groups. But we also had socialist groups, communist groups, you name it. It was a fabulous feast of activism, and we could do certain things together. Or anti-racism groups, then there was anti-Springbok tour, rugby groups. So there were moments when we could come together, and then most moments we didn't. And so the activism part, the public see activism when they look at a protest. What they don't often see is the work behind, what goes into particular actions. And really that's what I want to talk about then, because that's what really fascinated me and what I've thought about over the years is, what is it we're trying to articulate? What is it we understand about our experiences? And what do we imagine as a better future? In other words, can we do better than our colonisers? Or are we just going to replicate what they have done to us? How do we continue acting in ways that advance a positive and constructive vision for our society? How can we do things that include others? Or does it just take a small, fairly elitist group of fundamentalists to push action through? How does that work? The small who are prepared to protest and the great majority who are not prepared to protest. How does the small transform that majority? That's a significant challenge in most kind of social activist type contexts. How do you get the majority to, if not stand against you, then stand neutral so they don't undermine what you're trying to develop? How do you mobilise that majority? And it's a huge challenge. And I know when we were, younger, it's very easy to condemn those people who don't want to act. It's very easy to be intolerant of them and think that, what's going on in your head? Can't you see what we see? Are you mad? You get really impatient because there's something that holds them back. And the term that I now use to explain that, some of you will have come across in your studies, is the term hegemony or hegemony. Hegemony was when you take on a set of beliefs that actually work against your own interests. When you begin to accept the coloniser's view of you as if it's real, even though when you look in the mirror, you know that it's not real. So it's a really powerful inner sort of tool that keeps people from acting or keeps people silent. And, really that's in the end where our group kind of went more into the development of, we split into different groups, but I went into the field of education. And in that field, it was not only about developing our language, but in the end, our own schooling system. It wasn't enough just to try and change the systems that we were in. I mean, we did that. People would say, well, why don't you go and talk to the local school? We did that. Waste of time. Why don't you go and talk to the next school? Did that. Waste of time as well. So after visiting, many schools, we thought, well, what makes them so special? Why don't we start a school? And I think that's in the end a different form of activism. It's not the political protest kind of activism. It's the activism which says, well, actually we can build something. We've got the ideas, we've got the creativity, we've got the guts, we've got the passion. Why don't we just do it? And we did. We developed a whole alternative schooling system called Kura Kaupapa Māori, schools based on Māori language and Māori philosophy. And in that particular struggle, it came after the language nests, right? So we had language nests. They started in 1982. We immersed our babies in those language nests. Then they turned 5, and then they went to school. And within 6 months, they stopped speaking Māori. And so we could see that happening. And a particular parent group that I was with decided, no, what a waste of a 5-year commitment to have that happen. and hence our search for an appropriate schooling system for our children, and then our decision to start our own school. So we started our own school without any money. What we had was a group of impassioned parents willing to do a few things. Like some of them are willing to give up work to teach. Some of them were willing to find a space and argue for that space in which we could teach. Others were willing to engage with what at the time was the Department of Education to begin a political argument of having our type of schooling recognised. Another group were more interested in designing curriculum. So that kind of activism requires multi-talents. You know, it's not enough just to have someone who is good on rhetoric. You have to have people who can actually build something, design a curriculum, think in practical terms, because when you bring 30 children together, rhetoric doesn't last very long, does it? And children are unforgiving of rhetoric. You know, they want to play with stuff, they want to do stuff, they want to learn. And so, you know, rhetoric on its own is insufficient. And that's really what I tell a lot of my students now, is activism isn't about rhetoric. It's about action. And it's about acting in ways that are informed, not just about what's not working or unjust, but about where you want to go. What do you want to build? What's the new imagination? Where are you heading for? Who's coming along with you? And why would they come with you? What is it that you have that would attract others to come on board? So to me, that's that kind of activism of deciding I'm going to build a school. You know, retrospectively, I would say we as a group of parents didn't realise what a humongous task that was. Meetings that went late into the night, every night. You know, we would have a meeting and at 11 o'clock someone would say, well, I don't think we should open the school tomorrow. You know, we should all take time out and do a professional development day. And all of those parents who had to go to work the next morning would be thinking, oh my God, where are we going to put our kids for a day? So you had to get practical about what needed to happen and figure out ways to manage the politics. Once again, we had some quite creative strategies around engaging with power. They were fairly cultural in a sense, they were natural behaviours, like we would turn up to the Department of Education to negotiate elements of being recognised, and we would have a mother breastfeeding a baby, and that would absolutely upset the bureaucrats. You know, to have a mother whip her top up and put the baby on the breast and then sit back there watching while they were trying to, you know, talk to us about something and clearly perturbed and unsettled. We determined that the term kura kaupapa Māori would be the only term that we would use in articulating what we wanted to the Department of Education. And we took great delight in creating situations where they had to say the word. All right, so they'd get up and they go, about your bilingual schools. I'm going, no, not a bilingual school, a kura kaupapa Māori. You know, so that's what and we'd sort of smile when they sort of got it wrong and messed it up, but we had these little strategies all the time about how to unsettle as well as how to, in the end, negotiate a position about what we wanted. So pretty much for every hour of a negotiation, we would have a 6-hour meeting beforehand. Who was going to say what the order was, what we wanted as an outcome, you know, really clear about, all right, we've got we've got this important meeting, we get 1 hour, what do we want out of it? Everyone had to agree. And then we had, people in our group who we knew were just going to say random things anyway. And the whole point of it was to just have just one person who said random things. Everyone else had to be disciplined. Because the thing with the people who say random things, it also comes at random moments. And it's not always helpful. So we would try and manage ourselves as much as manage the context. And, we would have maybe 3 or 4 who did most of the talking. One of my jobs was to take meticulous notes about who said what, direct quotes that the officials would cite. So they would have someone taking notes, and we'd have 3 people who'd whip out a piece of paper, start copying down everything they said. So it kept the meetings really formal. But we did determine to change the legislation, and we did. We changed what was called the Education Act, or the Education Amendment Act, to create a special category for the establishment of kura kaupapa Māori. Now, you might think, in that context, that the activism ends because you've achieved a particular goal. But really, that goal is just a little milestone on the way to the goal. It's a little milestone which says, well, we've got this far, but there's more work to be done. And it's interesting working with our people because a great mass of people don't really want trouble in their lives. They don't want to upset anyone. They don't want to be upset. They just want to cruise. They want things to come easy. They don't want to have to fight. They don't want to have to go to school and have a kind of protest at the school gate. And that, I'd say that's the bulk of our people. And so the role of activists often is to do that fighting, knowing that the bulk of the people will come later. They're not going to turn up when you turn up. They will turn up when you've broken through the barriers. And that's just society. That's just people. And it's kind of knowing that behind you will be this group of people who, in a way, they show their support because they do turn up, but they turn up a little bit late. And they turn up when the major battle has been done. But the reason you do what you do is so they do turn up. And they have something to turn up to. That's why you fight. That's why you're an activist. It's not so you get to go to school. Right? It's so that a whole generation of our communities get to go to school. And it's always remembering that there's a goal bigger than yourselves, bigger than your own generation. And it's a work in progress. We had a big party the day the legislation went through Parliament, like a real big party. I think it was the last time I seriously drank anything. After that, it was worth celebrating. But the next day, more work begins. And even now, the Education Amendment Act was in 1989. So we've educated a generation easily of young people who've come through kura. They are now in the workforce and they're now parents. But is the struggle over for our language? No. Right, the struggle continues. And we have to continue to find ways that provide conditions, contexts, situations in which our language flourishes. So I think once you make a choice to act, you do a couple of things. One, you've got to choose to act. And in choosing to act, you also choose to put some things aside. Right? You make an active choice not to do certain things as much as you do to act in a particular way. But it's hard to go back from being from making that choice. It's hard then to be passive. It's hard to ignore all the other struggles. And I think really the challenge for many activist groups in our context is about being strategic. Which things do you struggle for? Because on any given day, I don't know about here, but at home, you could be working on a protest around the mining industry, about genetic modified food, about the environment, about the language, about the survival of our culture, about issues in the criminal justice system, the social welfare system, you name it. There is no end of issues that we could be struggling for. And it's hard to run a long-term campaign against everything. It wears you out, and it wears your senior activist leaders out. In the end, it's very strategic about what things you fight for and what things you live another day to fight for. It's not that you don't want to, but in the end, you're talking about a small group trying to break through something quite significant in order for things to happen. So, since my time as a student and my time in this particular group, Ngā Tamatoa, I've really had to think through those issues around decolonisation and transformation. What is it we're trying to decolonise, and what is it we're trying to move forward to? How do we work those out? Now, one of our key activist leaders who died a couple of years ago, his name was Sid Jackson. In 1990, he invited a group of us to a meeting, and by then we'd, gone our separate ways, done different things. Brought us all in, there were about 30 of us, and he said, okay, it's Waitangi Day. The New Zealand flag is lowered, and the Māori flag is raised. What are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do tomorrow? And he sort of asked each of us to think about, what do you do after you've gained some sort of symbolic gesture of freedom or liberation? What are you actually going to do? And what do you have to build? So you're going to work in education. What does that mean? You're going to work in health. What does that mean? You're going to work in the environment. What does that mean? And, I thought, coming many years after our youthful activism, was a timely reminder of how much work has to be invested in the building of really quite new visions and new institutions and new strategies and new plans and new ways of being, new ways of imagining ourselves. That requires probably more effort than the effort it took to change legislation. Because that effort is about changing every single person in the family and every single person in the community. How do you change a way of being, way of imagining yourselves, knowing that our lives are full of contradictions? Of course, we support our language and we support our schools, but our young people also want to go global. They want to communicate on the internet. They all have Facebook pages. They move to Australia to work. So how do you reconcile these significant influences in our lives? Where do you put your energy and your efforts? What do you try and build at home? And how do you, convince the younger generation that not only can they go out into the world and do what they want, but they're better in that world if they know who they are. They can act in that world if they know who they are. And that who they are gives them an anchor, gives them a distinctiveness, gives them an edge, but also gives them tools to survive in the world, gives them tools to read the world. It gives them sort of relationships that help them navigate the world. It gives them a code of ethics for how to operate in the world. In other words, what we give them in their identity enables them to make sense of the world and of them in that world. You know, so our Indigenous value system, our identity, the things that are important to us are fundamental tools for making sense of the world. And I think that's been a big lesson also, is you can be politically active. It's really important to engage in the world, but we also have to be culturally active to engage in our own culture, make a contribution there. And the real art is how you do both. That's the, how do you pull it all together so that it keeps you balanced and keeps you in a positive frame. Right, there's nothing worse than an activist who's got a used by date. Yeah, true. You know, I've been on committees where people go, oh, no, so 1970s. You're thinking, well, actually the 1970s were quite important, but, you know, been there, done that, move on. You know, there are new issues, there's a new kind of rhetoric, there are new challenges, there are new ways we have to think about what we're doing. And it's easy to be trapped in a particular discourse, and, you know, like, you've got to be really careful about, like, self-determination debates. We've got to be careful in our context about a treaty debate. Why? Well, we've got tribes who've settled their treaty grievances. So those tribes have signed a settlement with the Crown. In signing that settlement, they've agreed to put their grievances with the Crown, settle them, put them to rest, and to move on in a new relationship with the Crown or the government. Right, so they've agreed to set aside grievances. So what does that do to your mind, to your head, when you're a tribe? You know, you have to stop whinging about the Crown. You have to stop blaming the Crown for all the things that have gone wrong. You've got to think about a new relationship with the Crown, and make that relationship work, or partnership, however you want to design it. But also you get a rather large compensation package, which you then have to make good governance decisions about. That's really the danger when you move into that post-colonial, or that sense of we're in a post-colonial moment. So now we've got the resources, we can determine what the future is, but we're just going to pursue economic wealth like everybody else. You know, so when we've got control, what are the decisions that we make? And that's, you know, that's really the significance of the sort of decolonization moment, because if there's one thing we've learned historically is a lot of places that do move into decolonization don't get very far. They end up replicating what they had, because that's all they know. Right? So to try and build a new vision, you actually have to prepare new skills. You have to prepare new capacities. You have to prepare new institutions. And you have to actually put a lot of investment into that before you can even imagine this new world coming into being. You've got to prepare people. So, you know, my final part of this is those of you who are students, don't get sucked into thinking, well, I think it's more authentic if I go out and just be an activist and I won't complete my degree here. I think it's really important, not for you, but for later on, that you finish your qualification, that you actually put to rest those sorts of things. It's easy to tear yourself and make these decisions which in the end come back and slap you on the face. Right, finish what you're doing, finish your qualifications, get out, because you've got to whatever your career is, whatever your discipline is, you've got to see that as, okay, I'm building this new world, this new vision. It's in engineering, or it's in environmental science, or it's in education. I'm preparing for the future. Whatever your field, you've got to go out with that sense of preparing it for a new future. And if you can do that and build capacity around you, you're more likely to have a new future, because you're building it simultaneously. You're not just talking about it, and you're not just dreaming about it. You're acting for it, or acting upon it. And so, to me, the activism part is constant. It's what you just do. It's a program of action. It transforms your life. I don't know what it means to live any other kind of life. I have no idea. It must be kind of nice, I don't know. What do you do? You know, if you're not an activist. I honestly don't know. What do you do? I can't imagine. And I've got a family who are all activists. You know, my father was a teacher, my mum's a teacher. So I genuinely can't imagine what it means not just act, but not to serve your own people, not to serve your own community. That's a commitment of a lifetime, and you can't go backwards on it. Just won't happen. So I'll finish there, and then maybe invite comments and questions. That's all right?
One request: when people ask a question, can you repeat the question?
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I read an excerpt from my feminist methodologies class, and
Can you speak up?
I read an excerpt from your book in my feminist methodologies class. Do you identify as a feminist?
Okay, so the question is, do I identify as a feminist? I identify as a Māori woman. And for us as Māori women, our term is mana wahine. I identify as a Māori woman with mana. That's my feminist philosophy. How does that differ from feminism? You know, it means that we're also responsible for our men. Love them, hate them, want to boot them, whatever. That in the end, you know, our mana wahine is about us as extended families, as tribes. It's about our language, it's about our future, it's about our grandchildren. So our mission, if you like, is in the mana wahine framework it's about being Māori. So yeah, I did the feminism thing briefly, but I think our world is a little bit more complicated, and I don't think it's just about patriarchy. That's certainly an element when you're dealing with a colonising society. It's also an element in our own community. I'm not saying, you know, we don't have issues around gender, around the role of men and women, but we actually have a cultural philosophy that if we can get back to that, would settle some of those issues about treating each other well, about men and women living in a balanced kind of harmony, right, being equally responsible for ourselves and our children. So it's just a different approach.
Do you have any thoughts about strategies for building the kind of collaborations that you sort of hinted at or mentioned, like in the 70s when there were the feminists, the gay rights, the anti-war people, and then the Maori saying, "Well, wait, you're on our land. Let's start here." I mean, how do you build those kinds of collaborations, or what would you call them?
Okay, so the question is about how to build collaborations across differences. You always need communication. You always need someone in your group to be talking to the others. While, you know, there's some who've got control of a particular rhetoric. This is where we're going. This is what we're trying to achieve. You can come with us or do what you want, but this is where we're going. You also need people in the group. You need a communication strategy. I think that's the new term. And we did have that in the 70s. We drank together. And some got drunk together. We socialised a lot together. And it was really that keeping our networks open. We also had good relationships with many of the anti-racism groups, who were generally white or Pākehā people, were in the anti-racism group. So some of our members always maintained good relationships with them. We also had relationships with groups like ex-prisoners, Pacific Island groups, because what was called the Polynesian Panthers was a key group at the same time. That was a group of Pacific Island activists. So we always had ways of trying to keep communication pathways open, and then finding those agendas where we could support other groups or come together as a single group. So I think in our most successful public protests, you would have seen huge collaboration across diverse activist groups. So, you know, it might be they weren't in the forefront, but they were feeding people. They were providing vehicles to transport protesters from one site to another. You know, one of the interesting groups who supported many of our protests was actually the Quakers, the Quaker movement. And the Quaker movement would just quietly mobilise, and they would feed people. They would turn up at meetings with food. I can think of some protests where a group of activist Catholic nuns would turn up with food. You know, and often it's the giving of food where even your most conservative relations will give you food. You know, they may not want to participate in a public protest, but they will feed you, or they will provide a venue for you to stay in. So it's just, you know, communication is at the bottom of it all. Sometimes that's formal, you know, with an actual meeting about how is it going to proceed. I don't know if Hornet talked about that, but he's a master at mobilising people, and he's a master communicator at doing that. So not all our political activists are actually that great on collaboration. I mean, one of the reasons that some groups collapse is there's just more ego than common sense. And, you know, some activist groups really implode because they just get into ugly internal struggles, and everyone has to scrap, then that's it, all over. You know, that's in a way the nature of a lot of activist groups. You're full of ideas, you're passionate, you want to do things. There are no rules often. It's very hard to discipline some community-based activist groups, to hold them to a particular line. People choose freely, volunteer to participate, and so they choose to when they don't want to participate. So it does, I guess your most successful activist groups are usually very disciplined internally. Other comments, questions?
Alfred from Guam. When you were speaking about being an activist in the 70s and kind of how your elders really looked negatively upon you, back home with the civil rights movement, we get that all the time. I was wondering, how do you navigate that when the people that are closest to you demean what you do and think of you as just politically insane, you know what I mean? It's just, how were you able to navigate that?
We just did. We had some, we had 2 communities in the whole country that provided us shelter. And they were elders from that community that just extended their invitation for us to any time to go and visit and to stay with them. So there was one group up north on the way to the Treaty of Waitangi, or the Waitangi celebrations or protests, however you want to frame it, and there was a marae quite close that our groups could always stay at, and there was another community on the east coast. So we had a few elders, and actually in the end the ones who supported that generation of activists were our older generation, our great-grandparents, the real old ones. Our parents' generation were the most ambivalent and the most fraught, you know, and you can understand why. They were trying to make their way in society, and here they are, their children are kind of playing up and being ungrateful. So we learned not to seek their support, not to want it, and not to rely on it. You know, so we relied on our own support. Even in the student movement, I remember, you know, we went to the, I think it was the National Māori University Students Annual Conference. And at the time, those of us in activist groups were a real minority. And, you know, the others didn't want to talk to us. They didn't want to listen to us, and they just wanted to play sports and drink. And so we figured out we're going to disrupt this event. So we by then had learned how to control meetings. So we knew they wanted to finish their meeting at 4 o'clock so they could go and drink. So we just ran our own campaign which extended the discussion, delayed voting, made them debate things until they were clearly frustrated, and they had, in order to get out of the room, they had to actually have a discussion, and which they did, which we lost, but we didn't really care because we weren't in there to win their approval. We were in there to inform them of the issues and make it clear to them what the issues were. So it was always clear about the outcomes that we were seeking, and we were never disappointed in those outcomes, mostly because we'd predetermined what the outcome was, and then we'd go all out to get it. Yes?
What are some of the main characteristics or differences between the Kura Kaupapa Māori and the Statutory School education?
Main characteristics between the Kura Kaupapa Māori and mainstream schools. Well, the first one would be they're taught fully in Māori language. They're immersion Māori language schools. But secondly, they're not just translations of mainstream schools, either in curriculum or values and approaches, that they're meant to rely on Māori pedagogies and Māori philosophies and values of learning. So in that, the extended family is seen as the core support group of the school and of the students. It works, where it works well, it's magical, because every parent is totally engaged in the schooling. Where it doesn't work well, it just looks like a school where they teach Māori. So there's a diverse range of kura. It depends very much on the strength of the teachers and the particular whānau that support the school. And yeah, there's kind of mixed results, and just in terms of the outcomes. I think where it gets dangerous is when groups start looking inward and becoming incestuous in a way of just, You know, they just employ themselves, they just listen to themselves, they start closing all the doors around them so they can't hear or see what others are doing in the same movement, right? So they don't share. And when that happens, when any group goes into a defensive mode, it becomes kind of self-destructive. And I can see why a lot of our kuras are like that, and not just in the kura movement, but in a number of our initiatives. You know, if you go into an organisation, you can sense whether it's defensive. And, you know, for me, when I sense that, I think, something's going on here. It's not healthy. It means that they're in a mode of, they're in a siege mentality mode. And when you're in siege, you look inwards. Your back is to, what's on the outside. You don't see the good things. You just see what you're fighting against. And that's really destructive. Someone else had a question? Laya?
In response to the feminism question, I noticed that you sort of reframed the battle.
Mm-hmm.
You reframed it in terms of Maori language. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about how important that is to reframe it in your own terms, and then on top of that, reframe it in Maori or in indigenous terms.
Yeah. So the question was about my response around feminism, that I kind of reframed it using Māori language and using Māori terminology. Just personally, I think when you get to the Māori terms or words, they ground you, they centre you in a particular way where it makes your position clearer, what it is you're standing for as much as what it is you're trying to stand apart from. So Māori language, or Māori, A, the language, but B, the language used as a particular discursive strategy in activism is really important. And those terms, I always think of it as we have this never-ending well of alternative language to use when, for example, when the Department of Education wanted to call us a bilingual school. We could have come up with a whole lot of terms, but the particular term we used, kaupapa Māori, was specifically so that we didn't just focus on the reo or the language. It was on the philosophy, language, and the platform. So kaupapa is like a plan or a platform. So it's about trying to widen the positions that we're in and then centre where we might be in those terms. I mean, mana wahine now is a fairly accepted term, but even in Māori women's feminism, we went through a period, I think it lasted 6 months. Hilda was in there as a black feminism movement. I think Hilda was in that group. That lasted 6 months. Then there was like a black gay women or lesbian women movement that lasted about 6 weeks. And then our Māori terms help us kind of understand the relationships that we're trying to sustain and empower or enhance, rather than take up, a position or a word like feminism, where we didn't really buy into some of the some of the analysis that they were putting out there.
So, kind of sum it up, in my experience, sometimes feminism, maybe we need to redefine it on our terms, because I see sometimes there's Western feminism that gets injected, and it doesn't fit into our cultural values or norms, and it clashes. And kind of my take on it is that there is such a thing as Hawaiian feminism, but Western feminism really clashes with kuleana in terms of gender equality, because there's gender equality in the Western sense, but then there's gender kuleana in the Hawaiian sense. And there's some things that we commonly agree upon, that is kane kuleana and wahine kuleana. And it doesn't really it's not problematic until feminism comes into the discourse. Or
I mean, the elements of feminism in terms of an analysis of white society, which is helpful, helps to kind of analyse society in a particular way. But feminists, used to come on to our marae and then try and use that analysis on us. And then what do they see? They see the men getting up to speak and they think, ooh, power. And the women getting up to sing and they think, ooh, no power. That the men somehow are empowered because they speak. Whereas, we could offer an entirely different interpretation of that, which is, men get up to speak in some tribal contexts. That is their particular role for that particular part of the ceremony. But don't be a fool and think that means men have power in the community. That's a ritual role that they play that does not translate into power and deciding what's happening behind the scenes. Now, I'm not saying we don't have major gender issues. We live in a modern and colonised society, so we do have significant issues around the men, around domestic violence, around what happens to our women. So that is a particular issue. But I think our role as in terms of how we might interpret that as Māori women, and the stats show it. I mean, our domestic violence stats show that most women return to the relationship. So why would you have a strategy of, teaching women skills to function independently out there with their children when all the statistics show that for Māori women, they will return to the relationship because what's important is the children. And so you've got to look at how do you restore family? How do you restore relationships? How do you restore a man's well-being? How do you recognise how that happens? So, a lot of our women's refuge actually do a lot of work with men, trying to work with them in order to put the family back together again. So that's a whole piece of difficult work. Yes?
Kia ora, aloha, and mahalo nui for your presentation today. It's wonderful. I have a question about how the Kura Kaupapa Māori was then sustained further, because in many ways, the creation of it is the beginning, in some ways, of a longer journey, right? And often with activism, there's an end goal perhaps in mind, but then often that's the beginning of a new sort of journey in activism where you have to keep maintaining and sustaining that spirit, and people need to remain dedicated to other goals that come up. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit.
Okay, so the question was how to sustain our kura, kaupapa Māori. So, alright, so we had a big strategy for how we would make this work. It included a teacher education program, a pre-service teacher education program, which we designed and we had it accredited and we had it taught in College of Education. We needed a curriculum, so we had significant people in the community helping to write curriculum, draft curriculum. My job was as a fundraiser. I used to go and talk to really filthy rich people nicely so that they would give us money and that they would see these cute little children speaking Māori and they'd think how cute and give us funding. And for the first 3 years we existed entirely on money that we raised. The point of getting it into the legislation was so that our teachers could get salaried and our schools were funded by the government. But it solved some problems and created new problems. Right, so one of the problems it solved was our teachers got paid. But one of the new problems it created was then our teachers thought they should be treated like teachers in the mainstream. So they should have their own staff room, they should have, the same conditions of work. And we were thinking, well, we didn't fight this fight so you could get what all the other teachers got. We fought it so our children could get something different. And then the parents would say things like, they'd come to pick up the children at 3 o'clock and they would still be in class because they hadn't finished. And their parents would say, doesn't school finish at 3? Whereas before we were recognised, school could finish at 3:30. So people start to put in place then what they think a school actually looks like, smells like, feels like, and tastes like. And it just looks like a mainstream state school. So you've got to really work hard to have it look something different. Oh, there's a question over here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak more to the idea of the issue of getting stuck in a particular discourse. I'm thinking specifically of folks who are white nationalists who are super opposed to the idea of talking about decolonization just as a term and idea, because occupation is something very different from colonization, but just kind of refusing to acknowledge the psychological components of colonialism and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So the question is about, I guess, getting stuck in a particular discourse or rhetoric and how you might shift that. It is difficult because it requires those groups who got most at stake with the use of particular terms. All right, it requires them to broaden their rhetoric and their analysis and their discourse. So I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do. And one of the reasons different groups emerge is they emerge with a different analysis, right? Because they can't change the particular group that they're working with. So they come up with new terms or a new struggle. They want to define that struggle in a particular way. So it is hard, but it does happen, often. So one of the key words for us maybe in the 70s was about the treaty, recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi. By the 1990s, Māori were talking about Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And now, people are talking about post-treaty settlement or post-settlement era. So the discourse around the treaty is changing. It's dynamic. We talked about sovereignty and self-determination. But people who, studied those terms, went to university and studied the whakapapa or genealogy of sovereignty and genealogy of self-determination, said, well, really the word we're thinking about is rangatiratanga. Our own version of what it means to, which is often translated as chieftainship. But rangatira is the term for chief, and the role of a chief is to weave together people. So rangatiratanga is the weaving together of people. That's a better term for us to use in terms of an aspiration. So discourse changes all the time. But, if you want to deliberately set out, right, we're going to change the way people talk about schooling. That's actually what we did with the term kura kaupapa Māori. It's in the legislation. We had a meeting, we debated it, and one of the things that we decided was, because it's quite a long term with lots of syllables, and we knew that they would struggle with it. So we had this meeting about, is that really the term? Should we shorten it? Make it palatable, easier to pronounce? And everyone goes, no. We want them to say it every day. We want it to be on every school sign across the country, Te Kura, Kaupapa Māori, or, and then the name of that particular place. And you will see that when you're driving through New Zealand, the signs that say this is a Kura, Kaupapa Māori, and the name of the particular school. So that was a deliberate strategy. Now we look back and think, oh, that was a long term to have invented. But at the time it was quite important. It was important for us that they had it on their lips. That they'd be forced to say it. To us that was really significant. And to have to stand up and say it because it's got several syllables, so they couldn't actually stop halfway. They actually had to make a real definite attempt to say it. Will we do it again? Probably. Sometimes you are fighting over the use of a single word, recognition of a word. Many of our struggles, one at Pākai Tori in Wanganui, was all about a single word. We wanted that word, that term, because to recognise the term is to recognise its history, the significance to the local people. That is the word. Political rhetoric is very much about language and mobilising, politicising, mobilising discourse. Any other comments? Yes.
Much of the world is subject to global issues now, such as neoliberalism. I'm having trouble grasping that and how to address it with a wide range of different activist groups. How do you see bridging different solidarities to address these global issues that are impacting communities?
Well, I think global issues often have their source locally anyway, and they're definitely the example of a global issue is found in the local. And so, it's really getting a grasp on local examples, local case studies, local politics, that's really what mobilises. People are passionate about what's happening in their community and it works its way up. Having said that, my sister is an activist in the sort of area of biodiversity. So she's working globally, but the examples both of how to resist, but how to, how to build something new are found in the local. It's looking for local examples of how to do things differently, how to build a more sustainable environment, how to practice new governance strategies for conservation. All those things are found in local context, and then you use those examples to shine a mirror back in your own environment to say, well, here in Australia they have a co-governance arrangement in the national park system with Aborigines and it works really well. So why can't it work, in this situation in our own context? So you gather up all these local examples which provide alternative strategies, alternative solutions to whatever the global issue is. So it's very nuanced, in terms of what our global solidarity is, how that works in our own jurisdictions. Yes.
But I'm from the North Island, and see, one of the biggest problems with language there is it's the general language speaking out. Like, you look smarter if you speak English better. So I was put up a lot of rules to bring that pride to the language.
We really protected our children from interaction with the English language. So they only ever mixed with other Māori speaking children, both in the school context, but even in our homes. We protected them from English for, definitely for the early years. And they knew no other language. So, you know, they had pride in their language. Many of them, like our daughter, could speak English. She wasn't formally educated in English until she went to secondary school. But their first language was Māori, and so all the energy went into ensuring they could flourish, that they were literate in Māori language, that they could perform in Māori language. You know, that everything that you can do at a school, they did it in Māori language. And so they were proud. Actually, they didn't know they were speaking Māori language. They just thought they were speaking, you know. And then it got to a point in the early ones that they would define Māori. They'd think Māori people are the ones who speak Māori. They're not the ones who don't speak Māori. So we had to do a bit of work there for them to kind of understand the complexity of that. But for their first years, they were totally closeted in the Māori language. It's a whole different story to talk about then what happened when they went to secondary schools. Well, we started Māori language secondary schools as well, all the way through to getting entrance to university. They can do that in Māori language. And so, you know, in the formal education system, we've done, you can write a PhD in Māori language, you can write a master's thesis in Māori language. In my particular university, you can major in Māori language. So all the way, we've got a parallel structure around the language, but no one would argue that the language is safe and secure. You know, that's just the formal education system. The real challenge is, you know, what's happening in our families and in our communities, and then in some of the other institutions. So it's still a challenge. Yeah.
So some of us here are graduate students, and I was wondering if you have advice on how to negotiate kind of working in a non-Indigenous educational setting, but remaining accountable to our communities. I know it's an individual question, but if you have it.
How to negotiate
Being in a
a non-Indigenous
educational setting,
yeah.
with the standards you're presenting.
Being in a non-Indigenous educational setting. How do you negotiate it? I don't know, but you do. You just get on with it. I guess the one lesson most activists say is pick your struggles, pick the things you're going to fight, and if you're going to pick one you're going to win. You know, don't just... You're no use to anyone if you just lose battles. Right? You don't learn anything, you've got nothing to show for yourself, you're just a loser, really. You've got to win. So you've got to learn how to pick your battles and be successful. You've also got to learn how a place like this works. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, I mean, I work in a university and I know that there are pockets of the university which are horrible places, nasty, horrible places. There are other pockets where they're not horrible, but they're totally disinterested in you. They don't care whether you're there or not. And there are other places which tiny little pockets of support works. So a group like this is a really important strategy. How do you negotiate? You learn to come together. You support each other. You find opportunities to build your own networks, and if you want to run an alternative curriculum. But I think that's how I got through my first degree. I majored in cafeteria studies. It's how I usually describe it, because we spent every day, we'd meet at the caf, we'd occupy a whole, you know, set of tables, we'd take turns going to class, and then otherwise we were just playing 500 and euchre, playing cards, because you could count how many Māori students were at university when I was there. and you could count how many Pacific Islanders. It's a little bit different now. In my institution, there's about 2,000 Māori students. That doesn't mean to say all 2,000 have a fabulous experience. It can, depending on your discipline, can be isolating, can be just lonely, hard work. It's really important to build friendships. It's really important to be connected to others. It's really important to be engaged. It's really important to do your work. You know, and if you're struggling with your work, then to seek help. But things like this, I think, are really important for keeping you connected to each other. And, you know, when our students gather, they're the biggest, telltales on each other. You know, so part of my role is to look after Māori students in the university. And I don't know when things are going wrong, because they're not going to tell me, but the other students tell me. And so I get a good feel for when things are not working, or, you know, where pockets of maybe discrimination is working. Students will email me, or, you know, they'll come up one day and have a little conversation. Did you know this? And I go, oh, is that right? You know, but so that little, I call them my intelligence service. And we have a mentoring system across the whole university. So those are, you know, to me, our mentors are they're not even a secret intelligence force. They're transparent, but their job is to monitor what's happening with all our students, try and understand what's going on.
Could I add a little bit to that? Follow. My auntie Kuka Palau, she opened up the first charter school. Against the children that were falling between the cracks, that had the desire to learn, but not the type that was being put out by the DOE. So they had two sister schools that opened up, one on the Big Island, one over here, Palau Park. It worked awesomely. They got the children not to read from books, but to learn from doing, and understanding, to grasping their culture, their olelo, their passions of what our ancestors stood for. The DOD saw how well this program took off, so they stepped in and they clamped down to make it their own. So now she stepped out because she saw the poison going on. She could no longer handle it. So now she's working outside of the box, trying to find another direction to still continue on with that program, because that one has been basically blocked off. Mahalo.
Thank you. Okay, any last comments, questions? Because I'm sort of tired now.
Okay, I have one last, just a little bit more about how you guys as a group then and now create those futures, those images of the future that you can build towards. I think we can use a little help sort of making those really good images of the future.
I think you just got to constantly talk about the future, about visions and, you know, what you see, how you imagine it. It's really important to nurture the imagination and to spend time, give time to it. Actually, we're quite good on visions. You know, we'll get together, what are we going to do? Oh, what's your vision? So everyone has to talk about the vision. We were not so good as operationalising the vision or implementing the vision, because then you've got to break it down. But you know, I'm not kidding when I say that often the vision is found in the language. It's found in your own sort of concepts and in actually what you observe people striving for naturally. You know, what are families striving for? At one sense, it's all families. You could say all families are striving for well-being, happiness, being able to choose their future, being able to determine their own lives. There's some kind of big ones that you can, maybe a bit more generic. And then for us as Māori, it's like, well, yeah, we want those, and we also want those as Māori people, right? So on top of that, we want to be able to bury our people where we're from in our land. We want our marae to be where they are on our land. So you start to kind of layer it with, if you like, the things, the cultural things that are really important to people. And then there's a whole, parallel revitalisation program that goes on, not just around language, but for us around the arts, around performance, around Indigenous knowledge. It's kind of vibrant, and there has to be a place in that for everyone. Not all of us are in the voyaging waka groups, but there's a whole lot of passionate people there. There's passionate people in tā moko, there's passionate people in performance, kapahaka, there's passionate people in the language, there's passionate people in education and health. There's just room for everybody to be doing something with passion that's building this vision. Okay.
Mahalo nui to everybody for coming out and for really engaging with some really good questions. And I think this is one of the best I've seen where we had good engagement. So mahalo nui loa again. We really want to thank Linda Tuhiwai Smith for making the time to engage with us and our students. It's awesome. I have a small gift for you. One of our professors, Noilani Gunya Kaupua's new book just came out. We'll share the book with her and with Linda, and a small little trinket I made, little coupe bracelet. Also want to say mahalo nui loa to Dr. Margie Ma'aka for helping us set this up and making the connection with Linda Tuhiwai. Mahalo Margie, we would not have been able to access Linda, and we would not have been able to make the connection, and Margie was really instrumental in introducing us and explaining this event and getting Linda to come down. So thanks again. Awesome. I want to hand it over to Ilima.
I want to, first of all, acknowledge the space that we're in. We're in Kamakakua Center for Hawaiian Studies, which is a part of Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge. And, it's really here. This is one of those, what did you call it? Pockets of support, on the university. And a lot of students come to Hawaiian Studies because we know that we can be free to really explore these things and to really kukulu and ku'e and be supported in all of those things. So I want to acknowledge the center, our kumus that are here. I think there's one, Kekailoa Perry. It's in their classes that we read you, and he teaches really great classes. So sign up for his classes next semester. Focus in on issues of nation building, and they're really dynamic and fun and critical. I want to thank Kumu Maile Andrade, who has been supporting this Hawaiian Conscientism series back here in the Kihi this whole semester. We love having these discussions back here, so I really want to thank her for supporting us through that. Gotta thank Pono Kealoha, our dedicated grassroots videographer that's always there no matter what, and he's been putting these videos up on YouTube like almost instantaneously. So I know there's a lot we want to go back and see again and reabsorb. So always check out Pono Size. That's his YouTube channel, Pono Size. Got all the Hawaiian Conscientism videos and a whole lot more on there as well. So thank you, Pono. Thank you, Pono. And then, and our other kumus that are here from Hawaii Nui Akea, Kumulayana Wong and Kumunoya Warner from Hawaiian Language. Your guys' stuff is just as influential, even if we're Hawaiian Studies students. We're reading your things and the support that you guys give for students, so thank you very much also. And then we have to talk about our co-sponsor student hui, HAWAIIAN. I don't really want to define HAWAIIAN because there's HAWAIIAN people here, but we wanted to work with this really great dynamics, another student hui on campus called HAWAIIAN, Hawaiian Island Sciences. And basically it's a number of grad students, Katie Kamelamela, Eric Tong, Lelemia Irvine, and Aurora Kagawa, that have brought together a lot of students, especially Kanaka Maoli students that are in the sciences here. And it's a space to talk about and center Ike Kupuna in the sciences, talk about the ethical and cultural questions facing us in the sciences, bring in community discussions they have, and this is actually considered a mini version of it, HAWAIIAN cafes, which a couple times a semester, they're gonna bring community people, students, and various experts, cultural people, to discuss a particular science-based issue happening in the community at that time. So you really want to check out HAWAIIAN. You really want to follow what they're doing. It's a really awesome group. They also have HAWAIIAN pubs, which they had one last night, where you get together a couple times a semester at Manoa Gardens and drink and share about your research and get all inspired and drink. So thank you so much, HAWAIIAN. They provided all of the food today. It was amazing. Thank you, HAWAIIAN. Is there anything that any HAWAIIAN folks want to say?
Good job, Hamana.
Oh, thanks. Okay, that's the last note. Haumana is a student hui on campus. Again, we're the student hui for a community organization called Mana Movement for Aloha no Ka'aina. We understand that movement building isn't about getting the most people to join us, but it's about making connections with other people and the things that we're doing. We have a great relationship with HAWAIIAN. We have a great relationship with another student hui that's in the house called Oceania Rising, which is another one you want to follow and check out. And if we want to work with you, we want to get to know you more. So, together we can build on campus and in our communities, our shared communities. So, again, mahalo nui for coming out, and we'll see you next semester. Aloha.